The suicide of 20-year-old rapper Lil Loaded is a documented history of fatal negligence and extreme psychological isolation. In 2020, he accidentally shot and killed his best friend with a rifle during a video shoot. Charged with manslaughter and awaiting a criminal trial, his mental state entirely collapsed upon discovering his girlfriend's infidelity. Completely isolated and unable to face the impending legal consequences, he published a final online statement before shooting himself in the head in 2021. This is the cold physical reality of a firearms-centric lifestyle ending in self-destruction. The modern machinery of global fame operates with a terrifying, unpredictable velocity. It does not possess a moral compass. It does not wait for a young artist to psychologically mature, to develop healthy coping mechanisms, or to fully comprehend the crushing gravity of public visibility. In the digital age, fame operates exactly like a sniper's bullet. It is instantaneous, it strikes without warning, and it permanently alters the trajectory of everything it touches. A true forensic examination of Dashawn Robertson's absolute, unvarnished tragedy requires entirely abandoning the sanitized Hollywood narrative of a young man using music to escape poverty. That is a corporate myth designed to sell records. The actual reality is a brutal forensic examination of what happens when the global entertainment complex violently collides with genuine, untreated street trauma. This is the story of a teenager whose highly marketable authenticity, the very violence he survived, became the exact weapon that destroyed his mind. Bypassing the sterile environment of a recording studio, the psychological architecture of Lil Loaded was poured and set directly in the unforgiving concrete of San Bernardino, California, where he was born in the year 2000. San Bernardino at the turn of the millennium was a city grappling with severe economic stagnation and aggressive gang infrastructures. This was the initial baseline of his existence, but the environment radically shifted when he was 10 years old. His family packed up and relocated to Dallas, Texas, plunging the young boy into an entirely new, highly volatile urban ecosystem. Dashawn was thrust into a crowded, chaotic household alongside 4 siblings. The most critical defining element of this domestic structure was a profound, echoing absence. His biological father was incarcerated, completely removed from the daily equation of his upbringing. In the harsh mathematics of street survival, a vacuum of authority in a young boy's life is never left empty for long. The streets will always provide a surrogate. For Dashawn, that surrogate was his older brother. In the absence of a father, the older brother became the ultimate protector, the provider, and the absolute compass for navigating the dangerous reality of their Dallas neighborhood. But his brother's compass was heavily magnetized by the local underworld. He was deeply entrenched in the rolling 60s Crips, a highly organized, heavily armed, and notoriously violent street gang. Far from merely observing this lifestyle from the periphery, Dashawn was actively raised deep inside its lethal perimeter. He was learning the complex, lethal rules of engagement before he was old enough to legally drive a car. He was absorbing the vernacular, the territorial boundaries, and the fundamental understanding that violence was not an anomaly, but a standard tool for conflict resolution. The most devastating psychological fracture in Dashawn's early life occurred when he was just 15 years old. The brutal, unforgiving reality of his brother's chosen profession arrived directly at their doorstep. His older brother, the man who had essentially raised him, was gunned down and killed in the streets of Dallas. This event cannot be overstated. It was not merely a family tragedy. It was the total, violent collapse of Dashawn's internal security system. The one human being who stood between him and the absolute worst predators in the city was suddenly erased. When a 15-year-old boy experiences this level of sudden violent trauma, the central nervous system radically rewires itself, completely denied the luxury of a prolonged period of standard civilian mourning. Dashawn absorbed an immediate, crushing psychological pressure to step into the massive void his brother left behind. He believed he had to become the man of the house, the new provider and protector for his mother and his siblings. And in the specific environment he inhabited, providing did not mean securing a minimum wage job after school. It meant stepping directly into his dead brother's shoes. He sought refuge, identity, and income within the EXA, within the specific environment he inhabited. The concept of providing discarded minimum wage employment in favor of stepping directly into his dead brother's shoes. What same gang infrastructure that had just murdered his primary guardian. He weaponized his grief, transforming his profound trauma into a hardened, highly aggressive street persona. By the time Dashawn reached the age of 18, he had already survived and witnessed events that would permanently shatter a civilian adult. The reality of his existence was violently validated during a specific, terrifying altercation. He found himself in a lethal confrontation, staring directly down the dark barrel of a rival's loaded firearm. Operating on pure, unfiltered biological instinct, Dashawn raised his arm in a desperate attempt to shield his face just a fraction of a second before the trigger was pulled. The bullet tore directly through his hand. In a functioning, safe society, a teenager with a gunshot wound is immediately rushed to the nearest trauma center. Ambulances are called, police secure the scene, and surgeons operate. But in the paranoid, highly scrutinized reality of the Dallas gang landscape, a hospital is not viewed as a sanctuary. A hospital is a trap. Medical professionals are legally mandated to report gunshot wounds to local law enforcement. For a young man deeply embedded in the streets, police involvement guarantees interrogations, potential arrests, and dangerous exposure. Dashawn made a terrifying, highly calculated decision that perfectly encapsulates the sheer brutality of his environment. He completely refused professional medical attention. He bypassed the emergency room entirely and sought out the mother of a close associate, a woman who operated as an impromptu, underground medic for the neighborhood. She placed him at a table, retrieved a standard blade, and physically dug the lead projectile out of his shattered flesh. There was no sterile environment, there was no heart monitor, and most importantly, there was absolutely zero anesthesia. Dashawn sat there and absorbed the excruciating, white-hot agony of kitchen table surgery because the physical pain was deemed less dangerous than the legal system. This is the exact level of raw, unvarnished trauma that coded his DNA. He was a walking casualty of a systemic war zone. This brings us to the profound, deeply cynical intersection of street trauma and corporate capitalism. In 2019, Dashawn, now operating under the moniker Lil Loaded, stepped up to a microphone to record a track titled 6 Low Key 6 A 6 Why. He was 19 years old. When you listen to the vocal delivery on that specific record, you are not hearing a trained musician executing a vocal performance. You are hearing the aggressive, hyper-vigilant paranoia of a young man who has had bullets physically extracted from his body without painkillers. The aggression is real. The familiarity with heavy weaponry is real. The underlying desperation is entirely authentic. He filmed a raw, low-budget music video for the track and uploaded it to the massive, indifferent void of YouTube. For a brief period, the video sat there in complete digital obscurity, registering practically 0 views. It was just another piece of data lost in the algorithm. But the internet is an entirely unpredictable, chaotic beast. A popular content creator and YouTube personality named Tommy Craze, who specialized in reacting to hip-hop videos with 0 views, randomly clicked on 6LOCC6A6Y. Craze hit play, and the heavy bass line dropped. Lil Loaded appeared on the screen, projecting a level of raw, unfiltered menace and undeniable charisma that cannot be manufactured in a boardroom. The reaction video was published. What happened next defies standard logic. The digital algorithm aggressively grabbed the footage and violently amplified it across the globe. Within a terrifyingly brief 24-hour window, Dashawn Robertson experienced a paradigm shift of monumental proportions. He went to sleep as an anonymous teenager, desperately trying to survive the lethal politics of the Dallas streets. He woke up as a highly coveted, globally recognized viral phenomenon. The view counter on 6LOCC6A6Y exploded into the millions. His phone began to ring relentlessly. The callers were not local rivals. They were high-level executives from massive multi-billion-dollar recording corporations. Epic Records, an industry titan, aggressively pursued him, recognizing immediately that his hyper-authentic, violent aesthetic was an incredibly lucrative commodity. They handed him a massive platform, a significant influx of capital, and a recording contract. In less than a day, the machinery of fame had completely consumed him. The music industry had successfully located a young, deeply traumatized human being, extracted the darkest, most violent aspects of his survival, and packaged it for global consumption. They capitalized heavily on his reality, but they fundamentally failed to provide him with a single psychological tool to manage it. He was now a corporate asset, but his brain was still permanently wired for street warfare, setting the stage for a catastrophic collision between his newfound digital empire and the inescapable bloody reality of his actual life. The infusion of corporate capital into a deeply traumatized life does not act as a cure. It acts as a massive, highly volatile accelerant. When Epic Records deposited a fortune into Dashawn Robertson's bank account, they successfully altered his financial status, but they completely failed to alter his geography, his immediate peer group, or his psychological baseline. He was a globally recognized recording artist, yet he was still physically anchored to the Woods neighborhood in Dallas. He was still operating within a localized culture that demanded absolute, uncompromising street authenticity. In the modern subgenre of drill and street rap, the visual aesthetic is strictly non-negotiable. The audience, heavily conditioned by digital algorithms to crave extreme realism, fundamentally rejects standard Hollywood props. To maintain his highly lucrative image, Dashawn continued to utilize real, heavily armed associates and fully loaded, lethal firearms in his promotional content. The industry had essentially handed a teenager a massive megaphone and a blank check, entirely ignoring the fact that he was still actively playing with live ammunition in his front yard. In a world dictated by severe paranoia and constant territorial threats, the circle of genuine trust is incredibly narrow. For Dashawn, that microscopic inner circle included an 18-year-old named Khalil Walker, known within their community as Savage Boozy. Khalil was not a new associate attracted by the sudden influx of music industry wealth. He was a foundational pillar of Dashawn's life, a trusted confidant who had been present long before the viral explosion of YouTube algorithms. In the lethal, highly unpredictable geometry of gang politics, Khalil was considered absolute family. He was the anchor keeping Dashawn tethered to some semblance of humanity while the relentless pressure of global fame threatened to crush his developing psychology. The catastrophic magnitude of the impending event lies in the fact that Dashawn viewed Khalil strictly as a brother, bypassing any notion of rivalry or threat. The collision between the demands of the digital entertainment machine and the lethal reality of physical firearms reached its ultimate tragic apex on the afternoon of October 25, 2020. It was a Sunday, a day traditionally associated with rest, but the neighborhood was operating as an active production set. Dashawn, Khalil, and another close associate named Cameron Walker were gathered outside a residence in the woods. They were not engaged in a territorial dispute. They were entirely focused on generating content, utilizing their mobile devices to film a raw, impromptu music video intended for social media distribution. They were adhering to the strict visual requirements of their genre, aggressively brandishing real weapons for the camera lens. The psychological danger of utilizing loaded firearms as cinematic props is that the human brain becomes momentarily desensitized to their actual lethality. When you are focused on the framing of a smartphone camera, the lighting, and the rhythm of the audio track, the gun temporarily ceases to be an instrument of death and becomes a mere aesthetic accessory. But a Glock pistol does not possess a digital safety switch. It operates on cold, unforgiving mechanical physics. It requires roughly 5 pounds of applied pressure to the trigger to initiate a highly explosive chemical reaction. In a fraction of a second, the environment violently shifted from a digital performance to a permanent, irreversible nightmare. A weapon held by Dashawn discharged. At approximately 2:40 p.m., the silence of the Dallas afternoon was violently shattered. Inside the residence, Khalil's older sister heard the unmistakable, deafening crack of 2 distinct gunshots originating from the immediate vicinity of the front yard. The sound of gunfire in that specific neighborhood is not necessarily an anomaly, but the extreme proximity triggered an immediate, terrified biological response. She sprinted out the front door, stepping directly into a scene of absolute chaotic devastation. The visual tableau she encountered completely defied logical processing. Her younger brother Khalil was collapsed on the concrete, bleeding profusely from a massive catastrophic trauma to his torso. Standing directly over his body were Dashawn and Cameron. But Dashawn did not project the cold, calculated posture of a gangland executioner. His physical state was one of absolute paralyzing shock. He was staring at the blood rapidly pooling around his best friend, his central nervous system completely overloaded by the sudden terrifying realization that his own finger had just initiated the destruction of his inner circle. In the frantic, screaming hysteria that immediately followed, the sister operated on pure adrenaline. Seeking answers in the chaos, she grabbed a mobile phone belonging to Dashawn. What she discovered on that device instantly transitioned the incident from a chaotic neighborhood shooting into a heavily documented criminal investigation. The phone contained a digital video recording of the exact moments surrounding the discharge. The modern era ensures that our darkest, most fatal mistakes are frequently captured in high-definition memory. The footage provided a chilling, objective witness to the tragedy, heavily indicating that the shooting was not a premeditated execution but an act of supreme, lethal negligence. The camera had been rolling to capture a moment of bravado, but it successfully documented the exact millisecond a young man accidentally took the life of his closest friend. The immediate aftermath was defined by sheer panic rather than calculated malice. Dashawn did not flee the scene and leave his friend to die on the concrete. Operating in a state of absolute, frantic desperation, he physically loaded Khalil's bleeding body into a vehicle and rushed him to the nearest trauma center. He was attempting to outrun the mechanical physics of the bullet he had just fired. But the internal damage inflicted by modern ballistics is frequently too severe for emergency medicine to reverse. Despite the massive invasive efforts of the surgical teams, the biological trauma was absolute. 2 hours after arriving at the medical facility, Khalil Walker's heart stopped beating. He was pronounced dead. When the reality of Khalil's death was confirmed, the full crushing weight of the legal and street-level consequences violently crashed down upon Dashawn. He was a 19-year-old who had just killed a beloved member of his own community. In his severely traumatized, highly paranoid state, his immediate instinct was evasion. He knew the Dallas Police Department would immediately initiate a massive manhunt, but far more terrifying was the potential reaction of the streets. Gang infrastructures do not always wait for forensic evidence or grand jury indictments to exact vengeance. Terrified of both the state apparatus and the potential retaliation from his own neighborhood, Dashawn fled the state of Texas entirely, disappearing into a temporary agonizing exile in Florida. Imagine the sheer psychological torture of that flight. He was sitting in an anonymous hotel room thousands of miles away, entirely cut off from his family, while the digital world actively branded him a cold-blooded murderer. His record label was silent. The internet was analyzing his every past lyric to prove his guilt, but the absolute heaviest burden was the internal, inescapable knowledge that he was entirely responsible for the death of the only person he truly trusted. The money, the YouTube views, and the global recognition were instantly rendered completely meaningless. He was a prisoner of his own reckless mistake long before the authorities ever placed him in handcuffs. Eventually, the unbearable psychological weight and the realization that a permanent evasion was mathematically impossible forced his hand. Dashawn negotiated his return to Dallas and formally surrendered himself to the authorities. The legal system began its slow, methodical categorization of his actions. The Dallas County Grand Jury meticulously reviewed the digital video evidence recovered from the phone, the ballistics reports, and the witness testimonies. They fundamentally rejected the initial sensationalized narrative of a premeditated gangland assassination. Instead, they formally indicted Dashawn Robertson on a charge of manslaughter. In the clinical, objective language of the American Penal Code, manslaughter denotes a homicide that occurs without deliberate malice aforethought, but is the direct result of extreme culpable recklessness. The grand jury legally acknowledged that he did not intend to kill Khalil Walker. It was an accident. But in the realm of firearms, an accident still leaves a corpse in the morgue and a grieving family entirely destroyed. The legal distinction of manslaughter might have spared Dashawn from the threat of a lethal injection or a permanent sentence of life without parole, but it offered absolutely zero psychological salvation. The court could eventually grant him bail, but the judicial system possesses no mechanism to pardon a man from the crushing, agonizing guilt of accidentally executing his own brother. He was allowed to walk out of the county jail on bond, but he was stepping directly into a psychological prison that was infinitely darker, tighter, and more terrifying than any concrete cell the state of Texas could ever construct. The physical architecture of the American penal system is designed to confine the human body, but the psychological reality of house arrest is infinitely more destructive to a severely traumatized mind. When Dashawn Robertson secured a $75,000 bond in early 2021, he was permitted to walk out of the Dallas County Jail, but he was not walking into freedom. He was stepping directly into a highly monitored, localized vacuum. The court mandated the installation of a GPS tracking monitor, a heavy, unyielding piece of plastic and metal strapped permanently to his ankle. This device stripped away his physical mobility, confining him entirely to the four walls of his residence. For a young man whose entire survival strategy had been predicated on constant movement, hypervigilance, and external distraction, this forced physical stagnation was an absolute death sentence. When you confine a human being possessing severe, untreated PTSD to a silent room, you are actively removing their ability to outrun their own memories. Without the chaotic noise of the studio, the adrenaline of live performances, or the constant kinetic energy of the streets, Dashawn was left entirely alone with the echoing silence of his own mind. And in that silence, the video footage of Khalil Walker bleeding out on the concrete played on an endless, agonizing loop. The digital realm became his only remaining access point to the outside world, transforming his highly visible Instagram account into a real-time public diary of a psychological collapse. Dashawn attempted to utilize this digital platform to maintain the hardened, impenetrable persona that the music industry had heavily invested in. He uploaded his official police mugshot to his feed, appending a caption that read, "They try to make you look guilty even when you are innocent." This statement perfectly encapsulates the agonizing cognitive dissonance tearing his brain apart. On a strictly legal and intentional level, he knew he was not a cold-blooded murderer. He knew it was a catastrophic accident. But on a moral and personal level, he possessed the undeniable crushing knowledge that his hand had held the weapon and his finger had pulled the trigger. He was aggressively projecting innocence to an audience of millions while simultaneously drowning in an ocean of private, suffocating guilt. He was trapped in a digital panopticon, observed by millions of fans who demanded the ruthless, Lil Loaded persona, while the actual human being underneath was actively bleeding to death from a psychological wound that no surgeon could stitch. This brutal disconnect between his internal agony and his external commercial value reached a grotesque, highly cynical peak in the final weeks of May 2021. On the 27th of May, the corporate machinery of the recording industry formally acknowledged his market dominance. The Recording Industry Association of America officially certified his breakout single, 6LOCC6A6Y, as a gold record. In the traditional narrative of the music business, this is the ultimate validation. It represents hundreds of millions of streams, massive cultural penetration, and staggering financial revenue. Dashawn dutifully posted a message acknowledging the milestone, thanking his supporters for changing his life. But we must strip away the corporate marketing and forensically analyze the sheer, terrifying absurdity of that specific moment. Dashawn Robertson was sitting inside a house he could not legally leave, wearing a state-mandated tracking device, actively preparing to stand trial for the manslaughter of his best friend. The very song that the industry was currently celebrating, the track that was generating massive profit margins for the executives sitting in secure boardrooms, was entirely built upon the exact same gun violence that had just ruined his existence. The music industry did not view the death of Khalil Walker as a signal to provide their heavily traumatized artist with immediate intensive psychiatric intervention. They viewed it as unfortunate background noise. They shipped a gold plaque to a house arrest address. They handed a shiny piece of metal to a young man who desperately required a trauma therapist. It is a profound indictment of a corporate system that is structurally designed to extract the maximum amount of profit from authentic street trauma while accepting absolutely zero liability for the human casualties left in the wake of that extraction. To entirely comprehend the absolute suffocating pressure crushing Dashawn Robertson during the spring of 2021, the forensic analysis must transition from his physical confinement to the brutal mathematical reality of his financial architecture. The global public, and often the artists themselves, operate under a severe misunderstanding of major label recording contracts. When Epic Records secured Lil Loaded, they did not hand him a massive unconditional salary. They provided a cash advance. In the clinical, unvarnished reality of the music industry, an advance is nothing more than a highly predatory, aggressively cross-collateralized corporate loan. Every dollar spent on his studio time, his high-definition music videos, his marketing campaigns, and his initial payout was meticulously logged onto a corporate ledger as recoupable debt. The industry business model dictates that the record label retains the overwhelming majority, often upwards of 80 to 90%, of the digital streaming revenue to systematically pay down this debt. Therefore, to generate actual liquid capital and survive on a daily basis, a modern recording artist is absolutely required to physically tour. The club appearances, the regional concerts, and the festival bookings are the primary critical arteries of cash flow. When the Dallas County court system strapped a GPS tracking monitor to Dashawn's ankle, they did not merely restrict his physical mobility, they effectively executed a corporate guillotine on his sole source of income. The biometric cage of house arrest completely severed his access to the touring circuit. He was instantly rendered incapable of generating liquid cash. This financial paralysis collided violently with a new, terrifyingly expensive reality: the absolute cost of a high-profile homicide defense. Retaining elite, specialized criminal defense attorneys to navigate a manslaughter indictment requires massive immediate capital. Law firms of that caliber do not operate on credit or promises of future royalties. They require staggering, upfront cash retainers, frequently ranging into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. Dashawn was forced to rapidly, aggressively liquidate whatever remaining advance money he possessed simply to prevent the state of Texas from transferring him to a maximum security penitentiary. This created an unprecedented, devastating economic paradox. While confined to his Cedar Hill residence, Dashawn was generating astronomical global engagement metrics. His music was streaming in the tens of millions. Yet, because he had not fully recouped his initial corporate debt, the massive influx of streaming revenue bypassed his bank accounts entirely, flowing directly into the corporate vaults of Epic Records and Sony Music Entertainment. The corporation was quietly, highly efficiently recouping their investment off the sensationalized notoriety of his criminal charges, while the artist generating the revenue was actively, rapidly accelerating toward total personal bankruptcy. This is the exact chilling context required to understand the arrival of the RIAA Gold Certification Plaque for 6LOCC6A6Y. The industry celebrated the milestone as a monumental triumph, but for Dashawn, it was a hollow, deeply cynical psychological torment. He was holding a shiny piece of metal that legally confirmed he was generating millions of dollars in commercial value, yet he was functionally destitute, unable to leave his living room, and drowning in compounding legal invoices. Epic Records successfully commodified his street trauma to secure their profit margins, remaining legally and financially insulated while the human being who generated their wealth collapsed under the weight of a criminal defense. When a young man's entire identity is heavily constructed upon the foundation of being a wealthy, untouchable, hyper-successful provider for his family and his community, the silent, rapid evaporation of that wealth triggers a profound psychological destabilization. Dashawn was forced to sit in isolation and watch the glittering illusion of the Lil Loaded empire systematically collapse into a ledger of unpayable debts. He possessed no financial safety net, no institutional support from his label to navigate the legal fees, and no ability to work his way out of the deficit. The facade was entirely bankrupt long before his mind officially broke. This complete financial starvation systematically stripped away his final layers of psychological armor, ensuring that when the digital humiliation of his personal life eventually surfaced, he possessed absolutely zero structural, financial, or emotional foundation left to absorb the impact. He was a multi-million-dollar corporate asset who had been entirely hollowed out, left with nothing but a gold plaque, an ankle monitor, and an inescapable, mathematically certain ruin. The profound failure of his support system was actively documented in his final artistic output. Just a week before his death, Dashawn released the music video for a track titled Hard Times. If you analyze this release strictly as a piece of commercial content, you miss the entire psychological reality of the creator. It was not a promotional single. It was a highly produced, heavily encoded distress signal. The vocal delivery lacks the aggressive, unbothered arrogance of his earlier work. The lyrics are a blunt, desperate confession of internal defeat. He repeatedly vocalizes phrases regarding the impermanence of difficult periods, attempting to convince himself that the pain will eventually subside, but concluding with the devastating admission that he simply does not know which way to go. The visual geometry of the Hard Times video is equally chilling. The director framed Dashawn in profound isolation. The vibrant, chaotic energy of his previous neighborhood shoots is entirely replaced by heavy shadows, stark lighting, and a palpable sense of profound loneliness. But the most terrifying element of the visual narrative is the constant, lingering presence of Glock pistols, the exact mechanical instruments that he had previously worshipped as necessary tools of survival. The very items that had accidentally initiated the fatal sequence that killed Khalil are still featured heavily in his hands. He was entirely unable to separate his identity from the weapons that had destroyed him. The industry demanded the guns for the aesthetic, and he complied, holding the physical manifestation of his trauma up to the camera lens while actively suffocating behind it. As the calendar shifted toward the final days of May, the external pressures bearing down on his fractured psychology began to multiply with terrifying velocity. The legal reality of his situation was no longer a distant abstraction. He was scheduled to formally appear in a Dallas courtroom for a hearing regarding the manslaughter of Khalil Walker in the immediate coming days. The prospect of staring directly at the legal consequences of his actions, combined with a heavy, lingering resentment from factions within his own neighborhood who could not forgive the death of a localized brother, created an atmosphere of absolute, inescapable claustrophobia. He was entirely cornered, but the final fatal structural failure did not originate from the legal system or the gang infrastructure. It originated from the only remaining sanctuary he possessed. When a human being is stripped of their physical freedom, isolated from their peers, and drowning in guilt, their romantic relationships frequently become the absolute sole source of emotional validation. They place the entire crushing weight of their psychological survival onto their partner. In the days immediately preceding his final decision, highly public rumors and statements from close associates within the Dallas rap scene, most notably from a peer named Cyrac, began to aggressively circulate. These statements alleged that Dashawn had recently discovered his girlfriend had been unfaithful to him. The objective, factual truth of these allegations is entirely irrelevant to the forensic psychological outcome. The girlfriend vehemently denied the accusations of betrayal, but in the hyper-paranoid, severely degraded reality of Dashawn's mind, perception was absolute reality. He was a young man who had lost his older brother to street violence, accidentally killed his best friend, lost his physical freedom to the state of Texas, and felt completely abandoned by the corporate machine that profited from his image. The perceived betrayal by his romantic partner was simply the final load-bearing pillar being violently kicked out from underneath his psychological architecture. He had absolutely nothing left to anchor him to the physical world. The isolation was no longer just geographical. It was absolute, total, and permanent. On the 31st of May 2021, the digital facade completely dropped. Dashawn bypassed the aggressive posturing, the gang vernacular, and the corporate marketing requirements. He opened his Instagram application and drafted a final, devastatingly intimate transmission. He did not address his fans, his record label, or his detractors. He addressed the absolute highest authority he could conceptualize. He posted a public letter directed entirely to God. The text was a raw, unvarnished surrender. He explicitly apologized for his shortcomings, acknowledging the heavy, irreversible mistakes he had made during his brief time on earth. He asked for entry into whatever peace existed beyond the violent reality of his current existence. The concluding sentence was not a threat or a cry for attention. It was a quiet, definitive statement of departure. He wrote that he was ready for his heart and his soul to finally join the Creator. It was the absolute, total exhaustion of a 20-year-old boy who had carried the psychological weight of an entire war zone and who had finally decisively calculated that the pain of remaining alive vastly outweighed the terror of stepping into the dark. He hit publish, severing his final connection to the digital audience, and turned to face the brutal physical reality of the Cedar Hill residence for the very last time. The digital transmission to his millions of followers was executed in the early hours of the morning, hanging in cyberspace as a permanent, finalized document of his psychological surrender. But the physical reality of what followed was completely disconnected from the curated aesthetic of an Instagram feed. The internet consumes tragedy as content, instantly processing posts and generating engagement metrics, completely insulated from the visceral, localized horror occurring in the physical world. On the morning of Monday, May 31st, 2021, inside a quiet, standard residential home in Cedar Hill, Texas, the digital facade was entirely stripped away. The situation devolved into the absolute darkest, most primal nightmare a family unit can endure. The emergency dispatch center received a frantic, terrified communication from Dashawn Robertson's mother. She reported a severe, life-threatening crisis occurring inside the boundaries of her home. The initial communication indicated an attempted self-inflicted medical emergency. Law enforcement units and emergency medical technicians were immediately mobilized, operating on the protocol of a critical rescue operation. But the human body is a fragile, highly susceptible organism. When it is subjected to severe ballistic trauma at close range, the window for emergency medical intervention is frequently reduced to absolute zero. When the first responders arrived at the Cedar Hill address and breached the property at approximately 11:20 a.m., the rescue operation immediately transitioned into a clinical recovery and forensic documentation process. They navigated to the second floor of the residence. They discovered the physical form of Dashawn Maurice Robertson. He was 20 years old. The medical assessment was rapid and definitive. He had sustained a catastrophic self-inflicted gunshot wound to the head. The absolute finality of the act was undeniable. The physical weapon, the mechanical instrument of his departure, was located directly adjacent to his body. The young man, who had successfully commanded the attention of the global entertainment complex, was pronounced dead in his own home, permanently silencing the relentless, agonizing noise of his own mind. The immediate aftermath of his death exposed a deeply disturbing sequence of corporate hypocrisy. The major record labels and executives who had aggressively monetized his familiarity with lethal weapons immediately issued standardized statements of profound grief. They had capitalized on his violent lifestyle to reach a global audience, yet when that exact same violence resulted in a manslaughter charge, the corporate machine abandoned him to navigate the legal fallout alone. They financed no psychiatric intervention and secured no safe relocation. When the psychological pressure finally broke him, the industry seamlessly shifted its marketing strategy from promoting a dangerous rising star to mourning a fallen icon, ensuring their digital streaming revenue remained completely uninterrupted. The death of Dashawn Robertson cannot be viewed as an isolated incident. It was a massive, highly destructive shockwave that struck the absolute core of the Dallas music scene. In the years immediately preceding 2021, Dallas had been rapidly organizing into a massive, undeniable force within the national hip-hop landscape. The city was producing a completely new generation of artists who possessed a unique, hyper-aggressive, localized sound. But this rising empire was being systematically dismantled by the exact same street violence it was attempting to document. Just months before Dashawn took his own life, the city had been severely traumatized by the daylight assassination of Mo 3, another massive, highly influential figure in the Dallas rap movement. Mo 3 was violently gunned down on a busy interstate highway in broad daylight, a stark, terrifying reminder that the geographic boundaries of gang violence do not respect Billboard chart positions or streaming numbers. The subsequent loss of Lil Loaded compounded this trauma, creating a massive echoing void within the community. The city was actively losing its brightest, most commercially viable youth to a relentless cycle of incarceration, ballistic trauma, and psychological collapse. The very culture that was putting Dallas on the global map was actively, aggressively consuming the young men who were building it, completely dismantling the fatal illusion of street authenticity governing the modern entertainment business. Exposes the permanent legacy of Dashawn Robertson. For decades, the music industry has demanded absolute realism from its artists. They do not want actors, they want actual documented survivors of extreme urban warfare. They require the artist to possess genuine criminal records, actual rivalries, and a documented history of violence to validate the product they are selling to suburban consumers. The digital algorithms actively reward the most dangerous, the most volatile, and the most authentic content available. But Dashawn's trajectory exposes the ultimate lethal flaw in this business model. You cannot artificially separate the artistic product from the physical reality of the creator. When you demand that a 19-year-old boy hold a loaded firearm in a music video to satisfy a corporate marketing strategy, you are demanding that he actively maintain a proximity to lethal danger. The industry completely blurs the critical boundary between entertainment and reality. In a cinematic production, the guns are heavily regulated props handled by trained armorers, and the violence is a carefully choreographed illusion. When the director yells cut, the actor goes home to a secure, gated environment. In the hyper-authentic world of modern drill music, there is no director and there is absolutely no cut. The guns are fully loaded. The rivalries documented in the lyrics are completely real, and the consequences are permanent. Dashawn Robertson was caught in the terrifying crossfire of this contradiction. He achieved his massive success precisely because he was not acting. He was a genuine product of a broken, violent system. But the corporate machine failed to understand that the trauma required to produce that level of authenticity is fundamentally incompatible with long-term human survival. They demanded the aesthetic of a war zone without providing the medical and psychological infrastructure necessary to treat the casualties. When Dashawn accidentally pulled the trigger and ended the life of Khalil Walker, it was not a cinematic plot twist. It was a devastating, irreversible mistake committed by a teenager holding a lethal weapon he had been heavily financially incentivized to carry. The subsequent guilt, isolation, and paranoia were the direct biological results of an untreated mind attempting to process an incomprehensible level of trauma. The digital audience demanded that he remain the tough, unbothered 6LOCC 6A 6Y, completely ignoring the fact that he was a terrified, deeply broken 20-year-old boy drowning in his own living room. The ultimate tragedy of Lil Loaded is not simply the loss of a talented artist. It is the brutal, entirely preventable destruction of a young man who was utilized as raw, combustible fuel for a corporate engine. He survived the violent loss of his older brother. He survived taking a bullet with zero medical anesthesia. And he survived the crushing poverty of his youth. He successfully navigated the most dangerous physical elements of his environment, only to be completely destroyed by the psychological demands of his own success. His physical form is gone, but the digital footprint remains completely immortalized. The music videos continue to accumulate millions of views. The algorithms continue to push his aggressive, hyper-vigilant anthems to new generations of listeners. The record labels continue to deposit the generated capital into secure corporate accounts. He has been successfully transitioned from a living, breathing human being into a permanent, highly profitable digital ghost. We are left with the chilling, undeniable reality that the machinery of modern fame operates without a conscience. It locates the broken. It amplifies their pain. It monetizes their destruction. And when the absolute pressure finally forces them to break, it simply recalibrates the algorithm and moves on to the next available target. Dashawn Robertson was 20 years old. He deserved a massive coordinated psychological intervention. Instead, he was handed a gold plaque, a tracking device, and the absolute crushing silence of an industry that only valued his trauma.